How's everyone feeling about the amount of work?
A lot of information.
Too much? Too much to read?
Yeah.
To advance, it's a lot, right?
I mean, yeah, and not too much, but I don't think it's a good amount.
It's good enough. So before we get started today, because this is going to be a little bit different than obviously we've been in the constitutional study, and how we're going to approach this is going to be radically different than we did in that study, because it's a book study and we're covering a lot of material in a short amount of time. And so before we jump into some questions, try to give you an overview of how I see us pursuing this study in particular. And I think I said last week, I think it was really good that Noah had kind of felt like we needed to jump into this subject as well. And as we were considering it, we want to think in terms of everything that we grasp historically anyways as a study of culture. And so we're trying to get away from the style that you guys were doing, which wasn't a bad style. It's certainly a style, but having the tests where you have multiple choice and things like that. Because what I find to be true is sometimes it's hard to retain information when you're just remembering facts or people's names or whatever. And so as we continue to study throughout history and through ancient Egypt in particular, we really want to have a mindset that allows us to interpret through not just what the author is saying, but through a bigger lens. And so hopefully what is coming to our minds when we think about Egypt is there's biblical events that happened in Egypt, and eventually, right, as we get to the end of this conversation that we have, however many weeks it takes, we'll probably talk about the Exodus. And so I know your dad has said this before, and I know a theologian years ago had said it, but I think it's a really good truth that the Exodus, when we're talking about the book of Exodus and the Exodus in general, it's not just a story about getting God's people out of Egypt, but ultimately the design of it is to get Egypt out of God's people. And those are two different things, right? And so it's not just getting out of the difficulty or the challenges of life, but Egypt kind of represents the old way, the old thinking, the worldly way of things. And as we are interpreting and reading through this, hopefully some of those things will be coming to our mind as just being really aware of the difference between how Egypt was structured, how the culture worked and flowed, because it is very much rooted in a worldly system, and then comparing that to biblical knowledge and biblical truth of the Israelites and God's redemptive plan throughout history, and how that comes into contact, like in literal history, right, where it's not just a study in thinking about how we respond in our individual lives, but literally, Joseph and Moses and all of them that came into contact with Egypt came into contact with the worldliness that's there. And so as we're going through this, my hope is that we will discuss and analyze through that lens. It won't just be like, we read the book, this is the information, let's answer the questions and we're moving on. And so the hope of this will be to dialogue a little bit about how things are set up so that we can better discern and understand our place in the context of the world and how we relate to it. Because obviously there's a lot of stuff, if you read through the first few chapters, that talk about kind of certain things that were established in ancient Egypt historically from the world's perspective, and the big overview, right, was that the idea of divine kingship. And that was really kind of a new concept throughout the whole world. The way that operated was introduced. And so that's the general goal, is to continue to have conversation and understanding, and the hope will be that it allows us the opportunity to inform how we live out our lives today through that lens. So the first question I have, and it's not on your sheets here, it'll be a pop quiz, I guess, of sorts, is I want you to share with me, how did you go about studying this week? Or how do you generally go about studying something like this? Like, what is your mindset? What is your process?
Well, I went through the video. I like listened in the video that you sent with the book because I didn't have the book to read. And then I was looking at the questions and stuff and reading what it said about it in the book. So that's what I did.
So video first, and then reading through your notes, and then reading through. Good.
I read I read the introduction one day, and then I read the 2 other chapters the next day, and then watched the video that you put on the paper. Yeah, that's how I did it, and just kind of. The book is not what I expected it to be, really. I don't know what I expected. Not in a bad way, of course. I like how the book. It's very informational and like factual. I thought it was gonna be more like, the history of the world book series is. I thought it would be more like that, so it was a little different. But yeah, that's how I did it.
Okay.
I know what I did.
I do know what you did, and maybe you can share with everyone else what you did.
I listened to the thing and I didn't understand it, so he read the chapters to me, and then I did the videos and took notes. That's what I did.
Because you're an auditory learner.
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of more of an auditory learner too, but I actually didn't. I didn't even know there was a video. I didn't see that. But I went and read the introduction and the 2 chapters, and then watched the video, and then kind of went through the questions and tried to find them back in the book. I can't read them yet, but but yeah, I was pretty interested in the introduction and like even the journey of them finding stuff. I thought that was pretty cool. But yeah.
How about you, Noah?
I like to take a good overview of the prompt here, the overview that you give us, because obviously those are the things that you want us to kind of narrow in on as we read. In fact, you give us the main theme, which is the ideology of divine kingship, which obviously is kind of expounded on more in depth in the 2nd chapter compared to the 1st. So, because as we could see in the 1st, there was actually the 1st chapter, there was a lot of geographical description, which I tend to not really be too fond of, because you have to really develop the skill to be able to picture how those things work out. And I'm not, I can't say I'm super visually talented, so it takes a bit of an effort for me to process that. But it is, I think it would be a really cool thing for anyone to be good at. But anyways, the fact that you gave us vocabulary and a theme, as well as some questions to have in mind as we go through the reading, is really helpful. And also, of course, it's the reason you give it to us before we read, because the best way to receive information from reading or from even listening to reading is to have a purpose in mind or a goal, and what information you want to grab from the reading. So it makes retention a lot more effective. So that's kind of the way I approach it, is having these things in mind while I read. Making sure, of course, that there's kind of an interest there too, and not just trying to get through it. And then, of course, after that, in fact, this morning I watched the videos that you sent there on the study group. And yeah, that's kind of the simple way I approach it.
Good. So Noah kind of went in a little bit more detail, but I want to kind of move this conversation a little bit further, because I want you to notice that what we shared was the technical way that we learn, and that's good. I think we need to have a process in mind. But what I want to dig into a little bit more is how do we set our minds? How do we actually process information? How do we go about, and I mean, I think discussing learning styles is important too. Do I even know how I learn? Do I learn better visually? Do I learn better auditory learning? Am I tactile? Do I need to do something with my hands? Because the way that we learn is really, really critical. And ultimately, it is my sincere belief that we don't grasp history generally very well if it is just a process that we're going through to arrive at certain answers. And so, yeah, I did give you an outline. I give you kind of questions to approach. And so we want to follow those technical approaches. But speak to me a little bit more about just how do you process information, and how do you even set yourself up to learn? Do you go to a certain spot that sets you up for success? Do you listen to music? Is there something you do to even prepare your mind to receive information? Or is your habit just to, well, it was a sign, that's a really thick book, and it's Saturday, so I better knock this out because Monday's coming? There's no wrong answers here, by the way.
I usually have to be it has to be pretty quiet for me, especially when I'm reading and concentrating on stuff. So I usually like turn on a really peaceful song that like has no words and stuff. And it kind of helps me concentrate on what I'm supposed to learn. But yeah.
If I'm reading, I have to be like really quiet and super concentrated. But I was just listening in, so I wasn't. So I was like doing other things. But I try, when I'm listening, I try to understand throughout each word that's being said, which is pretty difficult in this book because some of the stuff is hard to understand. But that's kind of what I try to do.
I wouldn't know if I could study good in a quiet house because I don't have one.
Yeah, right.
I think what helps me learn is either if when I take my notes, I like to do it creatively in an artistic way, and I have to get it explained to me. So if I just read that book by myself, I probably wouldn't have been able to understand it because I need to be taught a certain way, which is kind of sad, but that's okay.
I don't really have to have it particularly quiet or be anywhere specific. I just kind of get the book or whatever I'm doing, either it's math or reading. One thing I really have to do is just kind of find my mind a little bit because I just think about things a lot, especially when I'm trying to concentrate. My mind kind of just trails off easily. So I kind of have to really think about what I'm doing. Like, for instance, if I'm reading ancient history, I think about pyramids while I'm reading because it kind of helps me put my mind to what I'm doing. Like when I'm doing math, I try to think about just 1 + 1 or something. And that's just the background of my head, not thinking about exactly what I'm doing. It's just in the back of my head, I'm trying to have it all correlate to what I'm doing so I can focus.
Yeah, I think that's kind of been the theme that everyone's sharing is your mind, whatever you do, if it's studying or working or being with particular people, your mind always functions in modes, I think. And you can actually, if you're able to harness or understand the fact that your mind works that way, it actually can be pretty powerful, I think. So the primary thing with learning, at least as I've seen it, that I've really tried to better in myself is the importance of focus, which is what a few people have mentioned. So when you realize that in learning through reading, for example, that your mind needs to be in a focus mode. I mean, it sounds very simple, but it's actually really important. So that if that is determined by your environment, so you need to be in a quiet place to listen to music, then that is important to take into consideration. So for me, I think I do like listening to music because music is kind of all day for me, regardless of what I'm doing. So I have playlists for like everything. Probably a little too much, actually. Anyways, I think Elijah actually mentioned a good point, which is visualizing what you read. So that's a really important skill that you can't just assume will come about naturally. It actually is something that if you don't have it already, then you need to work on building it yourself, which is when you read something, even if it's an abstract concept, to visualize it in some way, even if it's a little bit silly will actually bring about not only a better understanding, but a better recall or memory of what you actually read. So almost play it out like a movie or a video in your mind while you're reading it. If even that slows you down a little bit, then it's okay for it to have slowed down a little bit if you're at least understanding and grasping and remembering it. So that's something that I've been working on. In fact, I've listened to, or I've read a few things on speed reading because I've been kind of interested in those techniques, and that is actually one of them, to learn how to visualize things. Another thing that you guys can probably practice too is before you read something. In fact, we're given assigned readings, is you can review. It's called it's just a simple review, so you just like read the first sentences of each paragraph, or look at the pictures and read the words below those pictures. Maybe just read the conclusion and the introduction side by side, and just have that in your mind before you actually do the reading, so it gives you an outline before you actually read it. That helps a lot with retention as well. If that doesn't help, then don't worry about it. Don't waste your time, but I would recommend trying it out because it actually can be pretty helpful. So again, it's all about the mode of your mind when you're engaging in something like learning. So that's how it works for me.
Okay. So I know I asked this before we started in talking about the Constitution stuff, but how many of you would say, coming into this study in particular this week, you thought, I'm not really interested in ancient Egypt. It wasn't. You were like, okay, well, I know I got to do it, but it's not interest. Which of you were like, yeah, that sounds interesting. I'm up for that. Or were you just kind of like, meh?
I've always been interested in ancient Egyptian history, so I'm interested in it.
So you're right there. All right.
I was interested in it as well, especially like I said with the introduction. I thought it was pretty cool how they found this stuff.
I like learning about it.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting as well.
Good. So we'll be in a probably an easier spot when we're not trying to trudge through something that maybe won't pique our interest. And so the reason I wanted to have this conversation a little bit is because, ultimately, how we process information and how we set our minds to go about learning is often far more important than what we learn. And let me clarify what that means, because obviously we want to learn. That's the goal, right? I mean, we're ultimately here to learn something, to grasp something from it, and hopefully it's of value to us. It's not just, information that we're stuffing in our brains, so 15 years down the line you can say, well, did you know that the first pyramid was created by this person? Well, that's not useful, but we're trying to process through specifically to influence our lives in a certain way. And so how we come to understand ourselves and our pursuit of education is really important and critical. How we set our minds, set our hearts, whether that's emotionally being prepared, intellectually opening our minds to be challenged and expanded, whether that's being physically immersed in a place or a mindset where we can, in particular with history, where we can put ourselves back and visualize what it would have been like to smell the smells that are being described or see the pyramids being built, are really, really critical. But I will say this, the most important way that we engage even in studies like this is through the Holy Spirit. And so as we're reading history, it's really easy to think in terms of like the Bible, right? I'm reading the Bible, it's inspired word of God. I need to really make sure that I'm listening to the Spirit of God. And sometimes if we're not careful, we can pursue things like this with a more secular mindset, not intentionally. But my question is, when you're reading this kind of thing, or you're reading newspaper articles, or you're engaging in anything, are you mindful of the Spirit's work in your life, in bringing things to light? Because ultimately, the goal of this is not for you guys to regurgitate information that I thought would be good to talk about. Hopefully, as we're going through this process, there will be things that the Spirit brings to your mind, to your heart, that will be highlighted in there. And so there's two different pursuits, and I want to set this expectation here after we've done it to just kind of have this conversation. Is that moving forward, the goal is, yes, we want to do our best to try to answer the questions that I've written down. But if the Spirit of God is bringing you to something in a chapter that is profound and meaningful to you, let's pause and let's give that weight. Because ultimately, it's not, I have the information, Noah has the information, and we're teaching you. But the Spirit of God wants to teach you, even through a book like this. The other question I would have, and I will assume here, I already know the answer based on my own assumption, is how many of you, when you got this book, went and investigated who Toby Wilkinson is? How many of you in your mind said, well, I better test this out? Or how many of you just said, well, Justin assigned it, so it must be good because Justin wouldn't give us garbage? And so even in that, right, there's a way we need to set our minds to learn. I'm going to, as a good teacher, hopefully, I'm going to find you good information and things that are going to bring a balanced report. But particularly in the world we live in, and with history in particular, can be very dangerous, because you can have somebody who is very pro this side of history and is going to say it from this perspective, and somebody who's anti this type of history and is going to have that mindset. And what we're looking for is, you can read either, but do I have the ability to discern the intentions of the author? And if we don't know much about old Toby Wilkinson here, we don't know his intentions. We don't know his reasoning for writing it. We don't understand. So what we're doing, if we don't kind of test this out again, everything we interpret, anything we discern, anything we take in, we need to process through a lens of preparing ourselves to learn. And so we want to trust, hopefully, the elders in our lives, but that doesn't mean that we don't test the Spirit, right? That we don't take an observation of that and try to uncover some things. Now, Toby Wilkinson happens to be an Egyptologist. He's written, ways to study that, right? Like finding things out, or just like flipping through. The introduction does a good job of kind of painting you a picture of what is his style going to be like, but I can read here too. Is he an expert in the field? Well, he's written State Formation in Egypt, Early Dynastic Egypt, Royal Annals of Ancient Egypt, Genesis of the Pharaohs, the Thames and Hudson Dictionary of Ancient Egypt, Lives on the Ancient Egyptians, The Egyptian World. He was an editor for The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt. So we can assume a great deal about that, right? He's an expert in the field. It seems like, historically speaking, that's all he writes about. That's all he's focused on. That's his course of study. Well, there's other authors historically, right, that might take a more general approach, and they might be more biographical historians, meaning they don't focus on one particular season of history. And so, again, not to belabor the point here, but why do we need to understand the author? The root word of authority, author, is in there, right? And so to understand the authority, which is the spirit that's being put forth, right? Whether it's informational, educational, or whatever, the authority that this person is speaking with, that has to do with who they are as a person. And so we have to understand the author to understand the authority with which they're speaking, right? And so we want to, again, I want to encourage you and challenge you. Let's not make history, our time together, the way that we practice learning about it, the way we embrace learning in general, about getting information so I can regurgitate information. That's not helpful. It's just not. And it will be a frustrating conversation for us, because the last thing that I want for you guys on a Monday is feeling like I got to rush to get it done so that I have something to say so that we can go through the motions. That's not my heart for you at all. And in particular with history, and I've said it before, I'll say it again, there's a really famous saying, those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. History is extremely valuable because it informs the way that our world works. In fact, as you're reading through, we're going to be talking about this, there's some really specific things that the pharaohs or the kings did that are no different than how society is working today. I mean, the literal same tactics, right? And what does the Bible say? That we're not unaware of the enemy's tactics. So a study of ancient Egypt is a study, really, in a lot of ways, the tactics of the enemy, the tactics of worldly mindset, and how that can undermine us as a people. And so there's also some really cool things in there, right? Like learning the discovery of different things and how they work and how they were created and all of that. Growing up in my generation, Egyptology was like a super cool thing, because when I was a kid, Indiana Jones came out. And I'm sure you've probably seen that. Yeah,
one or two.
One or two of them. And that was like a big deal. And so everyone wanted to be an archaeologist. Like that was like imagine going on these big digs and discovering all of that sort of thing. And so we want to have a heart of discovery. We want to have a mindset that is clear. We want to go through the technical approach to things. But the goal here is that we learn how to process our world. And if we get some cool Egypt facts along the way, fantastic. And so I know that in talking with one of your mothers, just had shared with me, going, wow, that seems like pretty advanced. And it is a little bit more advanced than high school level. This is probably freshman level, college, freshman level Egyptology. And so there's a lot of, big words in there. It's definitely more, he can be very analytical at times and kind of set the tone for everything that goes next. And his style is definitely kind of trying to build on the geography first and then getting into more nuanced kind of conversations. And so with that, I want to make sure that you guys are at ease and at peace as we go through this process. And so if we need to slow down, we can slow down. We can observe, and we can make sure that we're getting what it is that the Lord has desired for us to get out of this course, and not feel like we have to just keep moving through for the sake of getting our course in Egyptology done. I don't think that would be productive. And so my hope is too that as we're going along, we're learning how to learn. And so I'm going to continue to challenge you guys that an important part of learning is verbalizing what it is that you see. It's challenging yourself in that uncomfortable conversation of trying to dig a little bit deeper. And so that challenge will be not just regurgitating information and saying, well, to answer question 1, this is the answer. But why is that the answer? What's the reasoning the author is putting forward for that? Again, it's you processing that information in a way that gives insight into it, so that the discussion can be about how did that affect you? How does that affect us? How did that affect them historically? What can we learn from that point in history? And so that's that. So so let's take a look at the main theme again. We're talking about the ideology of divine kingship here, which basically, I think, as you will note through the first 2 chapters, is kind of the idea of, or the ideology behind divine kingship is the belief that the pharaohs or the kings of Egypt were what? God on earth.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to learn, certainly culturally. And so I want you to imagine, again, using Elijah's kind of encouragement, imagine living with that worldview, where if you were a king, that you were God on earth. Now imagine not being the king and being a servant. How would that inform the way you live around that person? I mean, would it be a fearful thing? Would it be a joyous thing? Would you not care?
Probably pretty fearful.
Probably. Yeah, maybe not if you're like, what if you're like the right-hand guy? Like maybe you're not the king, but you're the king's, main general or something like that. Maybe a little bit less fear, but still some fear there, because again, that's a pretty weighted thing, right? Now we know that there is a true king who is truly God and truly man, right? And so even this, we have to filter through that lens of, right, like obviously the way that the Egyptians came at life, is it rooted in truth as we understand truth? No, not even in the least bit. And so again, we want to kind of keep that in the back of our minds, but also, I mean, again, this is starting thousands of years before Jesus shows up on the scene. And so there's kind of a history now of this kind of mentality of God becoming human or being represented and embodied in human form. And what is happening is this will be a precursor for the way that historically people would understand God in general. And so So we have this idea that the divine kingship is started by the king's being, having the power of God. And so with that in the back of our mind, the first question here with comprehension is this. The Greek historian Herodotus observed that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Explain. What did he mean by that? Or what do you observe?
I think he meant the gift of the Nile because people who settled there or next to the Nile like started building the foundations of the Egyptian kingdoms near the Nile. So it kind of was like not broken, but like came off of the Nile because they had to live near it because it provided livelihood. So
It made it seem like a really prosperous area, and like the plants and the river that was a really good place to live and have like cattle and stuff.
The source.
So yeah, in a sense, Egypt came from the Nile, so that's why we call it the gift, or at least that's what I think.
Any other thoughts on that?
Well, it helped with transportation, communication, and flooding, because sometimes when the land would get so dry that you need flooding, but also when it would flood, in the sense that it would leave for days and days and days, it would leave a bunch of good soil left to grow new plants.
Yeah, and so to Noah's point early on, and it really is in that first chapter, right in the beginning, kind of it gives us the geography of the land and how that worked. And so we've got to understand, yes, throughout all history, particularly in ancient history, it's even pretty true in modern times, where would cities be established? Near bodies of water, where they could get drinking water, drinking source, right? You don't set up a city in the middle of a desert. And so the way that just the geology and the geography of the land worked, it created a pretty great place. What we also saw, right, is that there is in Upper Egypt, which is in the south, and Lower Egypt, which is in the north. In Upper Egypt, they were really close to a lot of different like mining deposits, and so it was ores and gold and things like that. So it was really rich around that area. And so, as Herodotus observes here, yes, it's a gift because the Nile is really what gives life, and that is important because again, the way that they interpreted, remember, as we read life. Would have been kind of flowing into the second question, is this coexistence of opposites, and that the river is both a destructive force and chaotic, but it is also very life-giving. And Kayla kind of pointed this out as well, that word inundation he uses, which means flooding, right? Inundation would come consistently, and we see even in some places that were a little further out, right, with the Nabta Playa, which is further away from the main river, but the way that the rains used to work, it used to fill up that certain area and have a lake certain times of years. And so you had remember the two different types of people that we started out with in Egypt? There were the semi-nomadic people, and those were the people that would go from place to place following the patterns of weather, and then there were people that lived in the valley. And how ultimately as things changed in ancient history and the rain stopped and certain things began to happen, and there was some drying out, it forced those more nomadic people to become more fixed by the valleys. And so this is, again, the significance of the Nile. And thinking in terms of that, I mean, think of that imagery, right? There is that idea of living water. So we look in the natural and we see, right, historically, people are by bodies of water. Rivers in particular play a major role, not just in Earth's history, but think about it in the terms of biblical history. Rivers play a major role in our understanding of spiritual things. What do rivers represent?
Life. But it also can bring death, I guess, in the way of flooding, or the way it can take control of things with rapids and stuff like that. I mean, I've never been to the Nile, so I wouldn't know if there was a rapids or anything, but I would assume so, since it's a river.
Yeah. Well, there was, right, because one of the beliefs that they had. Do you remember reading that they thought that there was water shooting up out of certain parts where there was rapids, was coming straight from the middle of the earth. And so again, with Elijah's point, like put ourselves in that perspective of, again, not a people who can go to Safeway, here at lunchtime in 30 minutes, driving to get our food. But no, you lived in a place that you were utterly and completely dependent upon the consistency of this flow of water. And venturing too far away from it, you get into desert land. And so like you've got maybe a day's walk, and that's kind of the outside limit of where you can go unless you know specifically the oases that are in place. And so what the author pointed out, what I observed anyways, was 5 different things where Egypt was the gift of the Nile. The first was inundation. And so inundation is flooding. So we talked a little bit about that, right? There was consistent flooding on the river, in the Nile. And the second was topography. So topography is the way that land is shaped, right, moving up. And so it's you ever see those maps where you have like little rings, and as they get closer together, it means that there's a mountain that goes higher. And so it would be like looking over the earth. It kind of gives you a two-dimensional version of what should be three-dimensional. And so the way that the topography worked out was that it made it really perfect land in a lot of parts to actually have irrigation, where they could pull from the water at all different seasons to make sure that they're watering their crops. And so the topography of the land around the Nile was perfect. The way that the Nile carved itself through made it a perfect place to set up in an ancient understanding, because again, they didn't have like pumps, like these big well pumps. They didn't have the technology to dig way down into the earth and pull water up from underneath. And so the topography played a major role. Transport was certainly a major gift to them. Having the ability to flow up and down the river itself, generally speaking, is a much quicker process, right, of getting somewhere, right? Again, there's no cars, there's no airplanes. If you were rich, you had horses or camels or something like that. But for the common person, they might have to generally walk, but they might be able to get on a boat. But this is how power was consolidated, right? Those who were rich had the ability to get their message up and down the Nile quickly. Then with transportation, that's communication, which is very, very critical. And so if you control the power of the Nile, you control the ability to communicate. And so we saw right at the start there was 3 different kingdoms, and then one kingdom kind of got overtaken by another kingdom, and then eventually when we get to Narmer, who was the first king of all of Egypt, he got control of what? The communication. He got control of the pathways, which kind of choked out the other kingdoms. And so and then the last one is that the Nile is used as a metaphor. And so using that imagery, again, if I am, as king, the divine being, what people would understand is that being has control of the Nile. And so that can be a fearful thing. Like I can use the Nile as like, the reason that you guys are experiencing famine is because I have shut down the Nile. And so people will be fearful of that again, because in their minds and in their hearts, they're seeing this king as being a very particular type of thing. And so, yeah, it would have been extremely fearful to live in that environment. So you were either super rich and you had an ability to be involved with the king, or you were not. Moving on to the next. Any thoughts on that? Or I don't want to... And feel free to jump in if you have questions or comments. So we get the main point, right, that the first chapter is really trying to drive home, is that the way that the Nile flows and their understanding of it is what began to shape this idea of divine kingship. That needed to be in place for them to truly get it. All right. The second question here was the belief in the coexistence of opposites was characteristic of the ancient Egyptian mindset. Explain. So what is the coexistence of opposites?
It means something that is like light and darkness. If you were, like, we talked about a king that was the king of everything and the king of nothing, that would be coexisting.
So why is that an important thing to understand their mindset? Or what did their mindset look like? What was the author getting at here?
They're talking about like the opposite of being rich and poor.
That would be two coexisting, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the powerful or the rich, and those who had no power, they were poor.
It's interesting. In one part it said the creator god called Autumn. That's how you say it. It said it how do you say it?
Difference.
Well, it means totality and non-existence.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's also a big difference in their culture between gods and men,
Mm-hmm.
especially in ancient Egypt.
Yeah, so Adam was everything and nothing, is what that word meant. Think about this. It's all or nothing. There's no, in their mind, there's no in between. It's either all this thing or it's not this thing at all. 100% divine. Kingship means you're 100% divine. And if you weren't the king, it was as if you were nothing. And so there's really kind of, again, this mindset that is ingrained into the way that people would follow. But the king was not to be trifled with at all. The king was everything. It was absolute. And yet there was kind of that understanding too of nothingness. Did you notice that how their creation story started? What was the representative of that kind of the water?
There was a god
Mm-hmm.
that controlled the water that was really, really scary, but really...
Here's the way I remember is in the beginning, there was nothing but none.
Right.
In the beginning, there was nothing.
There was none.
It's actually funny.
Well, yeah, it really is. And so, do you remember here it is. According to the most ancient account of how the universe was formed, in the beginning there was nothing but a watery chaos, personified as the god Nun, the great God who creates himself. He is water, he is Nun, father of the gods. A later version of the creation myth described the primeval waters as negative and frightening, the embodiment of limitless hiddenness, darkness, and formlessness. So from the very beginning of their comprehension of time and creation, was it a positive or a negative? It was a negative. Now think about the biblical account of creation, because we see, don't we, in the biblical account, that there's an expanse and there is a void and there is a formlessness. But what does God say after he creates everything? It is good. So now again, historically speaking, comparing our understanding of history here, we see that Egypt's mindset is born out of there's this chaos and there's this negative and frightening and powerful and just really dark thing that kind of was primary to their understanding. And how does that negativity shape the way that a person would process information? Well, think about if you were raised in a family who was negative all the time, who didn't see much value in you at all, who spoke only in dark terms, would that not shape you in a much different way? And so again, we need to understand again, historically and biblically, that Egypt, from the very beginning of its understanding of creation, is dark and negative. and there's these opposites. But they believed what? Even in that darkness, there was a chance for what? Life.
I think it's interesting to include a little background biblical knowledge even in this, because obviously this is not covered by any accepted historical record, but if you take into mind the flood, obviously there's tons of stories across a variety of ancient civilizations all across the world that have the account of the flood in some respect, from the Greeks to Egyptians to I think Sumerians and maybe Mesopotamians as well. But those this idea too even expressed in the most ancient beginnings of Egyptian culture. There's this idea again of the beginning being watery chaos, and from that watery chaos being life. Obviously we see that even before the flood and the account of the creation, but even from that there's kind of a reset obviously in the action of Noah's flood. But it's interesting just to have that in mind, because without having that in mind, it seems like Egypt is the one that kind of precedes even biblical concepts, as it began with the Hebrews and how they were enslaved by Egypt. It wasn't until after they're exiting from Egypt that they had these ideas of the temple, or like even Moses, he himself came into Egyptian culture. So it seemed like all those ideas come from Egypt. But those ideas preceded Egypt because Noah and his sons, I think it was from Ham that the nation of Egypt sprang from, if I'm correct about that. So the Bible it's still even further back than Egypt's. So it's easy, even I kind of noticed myself doing it, it's easy to think, if you're thinking as modern historians think, that Egypt was the first to bring about these ideas, but these kind of ideas preceded Egypt even, as we can see through biblical records, which are not considered by modern historians to be true or verified in any way. But again, I think that's just an important thing to have in the background when you're reading through this, because again the theme that is displayed here is that Egypt was the first to bring about these ideas. But again,
right. And so that's a really good point, how we interpret it. Like think of the name of creation, Atum, Adam. It's just a different spelling, and likely to Noah's point, there would be understandings of oral traditions, and so words would change shape and form because they had heard the creation story, which we understand biblical creation, and so we see some similarities, do we not, in the way that things are shaped, but how they perceive them is important, and kind of to continue that line of thinking as we approach this, is that ultimately God is speaking to everyone, whether you believe him, see him, know him, trust him, wherever you are on the spectrum of life, right? There is a true and real God who has brought life into this earth, who has given breath to the animals, right? We see that in the Bible, the breath of life. God is always speaking. How we interpret God, how kind of gives us history. The way that the Egyptians understood this idea of creation from a negative standpoint takes them in a really fractured way of living. It breaks off of what God's original intention was. Kind of going back to the original story, right? Adam and Eve with God, everything was good. Adam sins, things are fractured. And so we see that play itself out throughout history. But yeah, this coexistence of opposites, this understanding of there's both order and there is chaos. And order and chaos exist. They coexist together. And is that how God has designed his kingdom and his purposes to work? Does God the Father desire for us to have a feeling of him as both chaotic and ordered? I don't think so. I think God is loving, and there is order, and there is process to it. And so this whole idea of chaos is really a fractured understanding of creation. And again, getting back to this mindset of a king, if you served somebody who half the time is really ordered and wants things done a certain way, and the other half the time is kind of manic and chaotic, how does that change the way you approach that person? Like imagine going to somebody with good news, but they were in a chaotic season and you didn't know it. And you approach them and it was, they just unleash everything on you. That would be a pretty harsh way to live.
You live in fear pretty much.
Right. And what we know historically is that fear controls people. Right? What is one of the tactics of the enemy in our lives? He uses fear to paralyze. And so it's easy to look back at history and go, well, I would have never stood for that. Well, if you were back there, you absolutely probably would have, if you didn't have a true and a right understanding of things. And again, this is why history is really, really critical. It shapes and informs the way that we live in the backdrop of what is going on. Right now, you and I are living through history. The things we observe, the things that we see going on in the midst of the world, and even within kind of more personal history of what's happening within our group, or even more personal history of what's happening in your own family unit, or even more personal history of what's happening in your own life, in your own heart. And it comes back to this question, is how am I interpreting and observing what is going on around me? Because if I don't have the right creation story from the start, and that creation story is fractured in the way that I see things, it will take me down a road that I was never designed to be on. If I don't interpret things from a biblical, spiritual, spirit-filled worldview, yeah, the author has a very worldly perspective. He's not going to give credit to biblical truth, at least not this author.
At the same time, he seems kind of very much inspired by this biblical theme. It's kind of
in the beginning, God incarnate. I mean, yeah, we're seeing parallels here.
He doesn't attack the perspective particularly, which is interesting too.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kind of neutral in a bit.
Yeah.
It seems, yeah.
Yeah, so we're getting some insight here, but again, we can look at that and go, well, what's that about? But because we understand that God is powerful, what we understand that God has touched historically every group of people. They may not have understood it was God. They certainly don't understand God in the right way. But they're onto something here with this idea that there's going to be a king, and there's going to be a king who is 100% divine. They're just a little bit ahead of the curve. And they're labeling somebody who is not those things. But there's kind of some understanding here that's taking place. So there's something kind of behind the scenes as we go forward. And so order and chaos, back and forth. We're now seeing kind of again how this mindset or this ideology of divine kingship can be born, right? We have the Nile, which is really critical. And so the person who controls the Nile is now in a position of authority. They have the ability to not just be like what had happened before, little tribes of people. But now we see how somebody's power could expand because they had control over the means of communication, the means of transportation. They could even take ownership of when the floods came and when the floods left. Because again, I think something like 99% of the people in population were illiterate. Well, if you're illiterate and you don't understand something, right? There's a limit to your ability to have power. If I control the way that things are talked about, imagined, and I can speak things with power and authority, right? I'm able to capture a lot of people towards my way of thinking. And so now we see that the king has this mindset that they've even written into their origins, so that all the people would interpret through that this God came from this negative, terrible place, that is just dangerous, it's fearful, it's chaotic. Well, if my understanding is that's how it was created, and I'm looking at this person now coming up as king, it is going to change my perspective, how I approach them. In the same way where people will pursue the Father with this mindset that he's somehow gonna, if you make any mistake, he's gonna just punish you. Well, that's not a true biblical understanding. God allows us to deal with difficulty, and God even brings difficulty to us through his love, because he's trying to fashion and form something in us. So our mindsets, the people who follow, is really critical here, because it was people that gave way to the authority and the power of this one man, but they did so coming from an honest place. There may have been, we don't know, people probably historically that were kind of like, well, really? Is that really true? But you wouldn't utter that. You wouldn't dare breathe that out. Particularly as we see, and we'll close it in here. And this week, again, we're going to kind of keep it on this. I'm not going to assign you more, because I want for you to revisit some things. If you feel led to just kind of go back and graze through again and see how the Lord inspires you. But when we look at the Narmer plate, right, we see the king being represented in what's called the smiting pose. And he's doing what? He's striking down one of his enemies. We see that on the other side of it talked about this, that he's represented as like a bull trampling over a group of enemies. And then there's this bodies that are decapitated over there. And so, again, they're using art as a form of authority. And we see that. We'll see that as we continue.
Didn't the guy in the video say they're either running away or already dead? So
those guys too.
Did they ever clarify? Oh, decapitated. Oh, is that,
There's decapitated up there, and so there's a lot of this imagery, right? And then notice even the biggest object that is on there is the king. And so we're talking about value based on how big an object is, and the enemies tend to be smaller, and everything that demonstrates this idea of the king being powerful. And we see that there's, do you remember which god it was that is like the falcon? Horus, yeah. And so we see the imagery of Horus, which their understanding would have been, that means that this person is divine. And so again, the way that the king used his authority through art, we'll see through the architecture of the day, we see through the tombs themselves, and which we'll get at in question 5, say a great deal about who that king was, who that person was. And so we begin to see how a culture could have been easily created and controlled, and how it would have been, again, going back to this ideology of divine kingship, that it was, and we'll close here, the main 3 points at the top there, that it remained the only acceptable form of government for the next 3,000 years. That there wasn't even a question about it. And that it was expressed through art, through writing, through ceremony, architecture, in particular massive tombs. And the dark side of it was there was an appropriation of land, and so the king would just take over everything. There was forced labor, and then there was scant regard for human life. In fact, to the point that early on, if you were working for the king and the king died, you would likely need to die too, so that you could be buried with them, so that you could take care of them in the afterlife, because their mindset was, this is not the only ticket in town. When I die, I'm going to be served throughout eternity, and so I have to bring food along with me. We have to bring all these riches and stuff, because what I'm going to be represented by in the afterlife is all that I have accumulated on this earth. And that doesn't sound like the true king, does it?
kind of sounds like a sucky life.
Well, it does. But understanding that, let's put that in juxtaposition with what Jesus says. Jesus says, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and yet forfeits his soul? So think of that verse compared to an Egyptian, it's in Mark 8, I think, compared to the Egyptian mindset of, I'm accumulating on this earth to store up for myself treasures that I'm going to bring. Right? Biblical understanding is I'm going to store up for myself where? Treasures where? In heaven. So these are two significant worldviews that are at odds with one another. Everything that we'll interpret and understand and observe throughout Egyptian history is like a lesson in what not to do. This is like the wrong way to go about it. And so as we observe that, we reflect kind of how does that then inform us in our own lives, in our own pursuits, in our own understandings. Right? How we interpret information, how we learn is more important often than what we learn. Because if we don't come at learning with a proper mindset and even asking the question, like, what is that true? Is that real? We can fracture off. And what we know historically is that people generally who were in power, they wrote the story of history in a way that favored them. Right? We'll see throughout Egyptian history that there's really not any talk of kings doing, being bad or doing something wrong or making a mistake. No, they're divine, they're perfect. And so we have to interpret through a proper lens. And it's why it's really critical, again, for us to begin with approaching this text with a mindset of certainly a desire to learn, to understand, and to observe, but it must be done through the Spirit of God moving in our lives. It's the same way we would approach the Word of God. Because this is in the Word of God, it's much easier to trust the authority. This is the word of a man. And so it means that it's flawed, right? We know that from the outset. But things that are said in here are factually true. And there's probably some observations that he's making, that he's presenting, that are likely good observations. But we're not going to form our life around the world according to Toby Wilkinson. We want to interpret Egyptian history through the lens of God. And what was at play and what was at work? And how did the Egyptians either misunderstand or ignore completely when it comes to the things of the Lord? And again, to Noah's point, which I think is really insightful, they were borrowing a lot of things from things that they had heard from other communities of people, cultures of people, and that shapes them, molds them. And so good job again this week. No extra homework. I would encourage you to maybe consider how you approached the chapter and maybe go back. It's not you have to read it, but allow the Spirit of God to kind of move in a way. And if there were questions that you had or notes that you had, let's also make a point to talk about that and leave some time to talk about not what I have set forth, but what you desire to debate and discuss and dialogue. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.